Hello YouTubers, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be replacing the front brake pads and rotors on my wife's 2012 Maserati Granturismo S. If you own a S or SQ4 Levante, Ghibli, or Quattroporte, then this video will be helpful for you, since all those models share a similar 6-piston brake caliper design as my Granturismo. When I called my local dealer, they quoted me something crazy like $3,600 to have the front brake serviced. But today, I'll show you how to DIY-dan it for under $1,000. Let me show you. The first thing we have to do is lift the car. There are 2 jack points on either side of the car behind the front wheels. When I lift my car, I like to use a block of wood between the frame and jack to ensure I don't scratch or damage anything. Once you have the car lifted, don't forget to slide a jack stand under the car for safety. Once the car is lifted, I'm now ready to remove the front tire. I'm using a DeWalt impact gun and 22mm socket to accomplish this. If you don't have one of these impact guns, I highly recommend them. They make for removing crazy tight nuts and bolts a breeze. Now that I have the wheel removed, I can finally get a good look at the brake caliper and pads. As you can see, the brake pads on our Granturismo are pretty worn down and are due for replacement. Before I dive into servicing this caliper, here are some of the names of the components that I'll be referring to as I remove them. First thing I do is remove the 13mm bolt from the brake caliper retaining bolt. This 13mm bolt is located on the back side of the caliper. Once the bolt is removed, the retaining bolt should slide out. If it doesn't, use a little bit of penetrating oil and some channel locks to wiggle it loose. Next, I remove the 2 brake caliper pins from the brake caliper. These pins hold the brake pad spring in place. I'll be using a punch and hammer to remove the pins from my caliper. The pins on my caliper didn't take a lot of force to remove, and I was very careful to make sure the punch always stayed firmly planted on the end of the pin as not to damage the paint on the brake caliper. If you are having trouble removing the pins from your brake caliper, try lubricating the front and back side of the pins. If that doesn't work, try pushing down on the brake pad spring to release tension from the brake caliper pins, while simultaneously hitting the caliper pin with a punch and hammer. Before I can remove the brake pads, I must disconnect the brake pad wear sensor from the wiring harness. You do this by disconnecting the connector located by the upper A-arm. After disconnecting the connector to the sensor, I then had to cut a zip tie that was holding the sensor wire to the brake line. I'm now at the point where I can remove the brake pads, but I can't remove them right now. I need to first release pressure from the caliper pistons that are pressing the brake pads against the brake rotor. I do this by wedging a flathead screwdriver between the brake pad and rotor, and then carefully push the brake pads away from the rotor with a screwdriver like this. You will want to push the brake pads as far back as possible. This will ensure the caliper pistons are no longer sticking out and are now flush. If the caliper pistons are not flush with the body of the brake caliper, you may have some trouble installing your new brake pads. Alright, we got the caliper completely undressed, so the next thing we have to do is we're going to remove the caliper, but before we do that, we have to remove these 2 13mm bolts that hold on this rotor. So I'm just going to stick in this screwdriver right here, which will lock it into place to prevent it from turning, and then just remove these 2 bolts. Alright, that's done. So let's loosen up the bolts that hold on the caliper. After I removed the brake caliper, I parked it on this jack stand until I'm ready to reinstall it. Never let a brake caliper hang by its brake line. With the brake caliper removed, the brake rotor should slide off. If it doesn't, give the brake rotor a few whacks from the backside of the rotor with a rubber mallet. Here I'm using an engine degreaser and a brush to scrub away the dirt and grease from the steering knuckle and hub assembly. This isn't necessary to do, but I like to start with clean parts when it comes time to install all of the new stuff. I also gave the brake caliper pins, brake pad springs, and brake calipers the same wash treatment. Now that I have all the parts clean, I'm now ready to reassemble everything. First, I install my new brake rotor and tighten the two 13mm bolts that hold it in place. I'm sure you guys have figured out that this isn't a new brake rotor I'm installing. Unfortunately, the new brake rotors I had ordered are running a bit late in the mail, so I'm using my old rotor so I can finish the video before the cold front moves in. Next, I carefully lift my freshly cleaned brake caliper off of the jack stand, position it into place, and tighten the two 21mm Allen bolts. FYI, Maserati recommends that you always replace the bolts to the brake caliper when servicing them. If you need new bolts, I'll leave the part numbers to them in the description. My Maserati shop manual specifies the torque value for these bolts to be between 110 and 120 Newton meters, or 81 to 88.5 foot-pounds. Here's the brake pads I went with. These are EBC red stuff, ceramic pads. With a ceramic pad, you'll get less dust over, say, a metallic pad. So hopefully I won't be cleaning the wheels so often now that these pads are installed. And the nice thing about these pads is they also have the cutout for the brake pad wear sensor. And my brake pad wear sensor is in here. There we go. The brake pad wear sensor just slides into the groove on the brake pad like so. The wear sensor can only fit on the brake pad one way, so it's impossible to install it wrong. Before I install the new brake pads, I apply a thin coat of brake grease to the backside of the brake pads where it comes in contact with the caliper pistons. Keeping some brake grease on the back of the brake pads keeps the metal-to-metal vibrations to a minimum and will also help prevent parts from rusting. Now that the brake pad wear sensor is installed and grease has been applied to the backside of the brake pad, I can now install them. My brake pads dropped right in without any problems. If you are having problems getting your brake pads to drop in, then check to make sure the brake caliper pistons are flush with the body of the caliper. With the brake pads installed, I'm now ready to install the brake pad tensioning spring, pins, and retaining bolt. Make sure the arrow is always facing up when installing the brake pad tensioning spring. Once I have the tensioning spring in place, I insert the two brake caliper pins. I used a hammer and punch to gently tap my caliper pins into place. And then use your punch just to get these in that last couple millimeters. Then we got this final piece to install, should just slide in. And then tighten your 13mm bolt on the back. Next, I connect my new brake pad wear sensor and secure it with a zip tie. I like to double check the torque specs to the caliper bolts one last time before putting the wheel back on. Here, I am torquing the caliper bolts to 85 foot-pounds, which is right in line with the factory specifications. When I install the wheel, I always start my wheel lug bolts by hand first and never use an impact gun to tighten them. Impact guns can easily cross-thread bolts and over-tighten them. My Maserati shop manual is recommending a torque value of 98 Newton meters or about 73 foot-pounds for the wheel lug bolts. Now that I have the front wheels back on, there is just one final thing left to do, and that's to start the car and pump the brakes. Don't be alarmed that the brake pedal will go to the floor for the first time. This is completely normal after changing the front brake pads and rotors. You should only have to pump the brakes 3 to 5 times before the pedal firms up. So here's the finished product. If you remember earlier, I said my local Maserati dealer quoted me over $3,600 for our front brake service, and I was able to do the work myself for under $1,000. Here's a breakdown of what the part set me back at the time of filming for this video. The brake pads set me back $140, grease for the back side of the brake pads was $13, 4 new caliper bolts were $20, and 2 new front brake rotors were $750 for a grand total of $923. As you can see, doing minor maintenance items yourself can save you a considerable amount of money. Was this job hard? Not at all. In fact, changing the brake pads and rotors on my wife's Maserati is no different than changing them on her daily driver. So don't let the dealer scare you into thinking they are the only ones that can service this car. If you'd like to see more Maserati DIY videos, make sure you hit that like button. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments section, and I'll do my best to answer them. So long.